Hi, my name's Tammy Bradford. I am the manager of the Creston Museum, and this is a Creston History Short. If you're talking about Creston's history, you have to talk about fruit. It's what we are known for, what we have always been known for. The orchard industry in the Creston Valley actually goes back well over 100 years to the 1890s when the first apple trees were brought in, mostly from Ontario, and planted in small orchards around the valley. You know, when we say small orchards, you can't envision the acres and acres and acres of nice, large, fully developed fruit trees that you see when you drive through the valley today. This was very much subsistence farming. The orchards were small and they were surrounded by fields of tree stumps because the first orchardists were coming in here and quite literally carving their livelihood out of the wilderness. They'd have to cut down the natural trees, stump the land, pull out the underbrush, and then plant their trees. And it might take 5 years before those apple trees started producing. So in between, you would see crops of small fruits and vegetables. You'd have cows and chickens grazing amongst the trees simply because the early orchardists needed these other resources in order to create their livelihood. They might sell some of those smaller crops, but they were also using them for their own food sources. In 1908, there was a massive orchard land sale. The provincial government sold Crown land. Local people who had bought large tracts of it got in on the act as well and started selling off some of these large 40, 60 acre blocks that they had acquired as Crown land. And we see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres of land being sold in that sale in October 1908. And that was really the start of the Creston Valley fruit boom. Within 5 years, most of those lands had been cleared, planted to orchards, and were starting to produce fruit. And the number one fruit in the valley was apples. We have orchard surveys that show the number of trees on each orchard property and how many were apples and how many were other varieties such as plums or pears. Creston might be known for cherries today, but that is a really recent development. Did not start happening until the 1990s actually that cherries became or started becoming the dominant crop. Prior to that, it was apples. The early orchardists came here to grow apples. A big reason for that is the long-keeping qualities of apples compared to cherries. Also, some of the fruits, the early fruits that they were trying really weren't that good. Peaches, for example, are a really tricky crop in this valley because the growing season isn't always quite long enough. A late frost in the spring or an early frost in the fall can devastate the peach crop here. So when you look back at these orchard surveys, you see many, many different varieties of apples. Everything from Wealthies to Duchess to the Macintosh and Delicious. In fact, in 1947, the local packing sheds shipped out 53 different varieties of apples. And that ranged from 2 boxes of Maiden's Blush to hundreds of thousands of Macs and Delicious. Immediately after that, starting in the late 1940s, early 1950s, the packing sheds started restricting what they were going to take. They were looking for the really commercially viable varieties of apples, and that became the Macintosh and the Delicious. In fact, these two varieties of apples were so important to the valley's economy that we actually named a hockey team after them. We have the Creston Valley Delmacs, who were a semi-professional hockey league here in the valley from the 1940s on into at least the 1960s. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the provincial government introduced a program that basically subsidized the farmers to replace their orchards, the old trees in their orchards. It also encouraged the farmers to replant any type of orchard fruit. You didn't have to replant in apples, you could replant in anything you wanted. This, combined with the fact that little cherry disease had been eradicated from the valley, and apple prices were going down, and cherry prices were significantly higher, this made it very, very lucrative, or potentially lucrative, for the farmers to switch from apples to cherries. That's why in the 1990s you see apple trees being ripped out by the acreful and replaced with cherries. That's when Creston started to become known as the cherry growing area that it is today. It will be interesting to see what happens in the future. Cherries are a very volatile market, and a lot of the farmers today are going back to those mixed orchards that we saw in the early 1900s. They've got the apples and the cherries, but also the plums and the pears and the peaches apricots, nectarines. They are catering more specifically to the fruit stand market and the local demand. I'm Tammy Bradford, and this has been a Creston History Short.